Trucking is a highly regulated industry. But what does this pandemic do to the regulations that were in process or will be coming? We asked Dan Horvath of the ATA what he sees, both currently and coming down the line. Hey, Dan, thanks for sharing the time with us today. In this COVID-19 era, what has been the impact on the regulations or the proposed regulations that are in the pipeline right now? Where do we stand on that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Doug. It's interesting going into this from the onset. We've been talking a lot about hours of service. So that was one of the first questions that came up with my team is how does COVID-19 impact hours of service? And while there's certainly an impact, and this could, potentially and likely will slow that rulemaking process down. The good news is we received, kind of input from FMCSA not so long ago that rulemakings are still happening, and I think that's evident with some regulations that have come out here recently, what I'll talk about. But with hours of service specifically, that was moving pretty fast. I mean, from a rulemaking perspective, certainly to see that move from the ANPRM to the NPRM, and then here this past October, have a comment period close. We were hopeful, ATA was hopeful to see something in the beginning part of 2020. So while we might not see that as soon as we'd like, we are still encouraged to see that moving through the agency process. It's at Office of Management and Budget currently. ATA staff was in there just, and I'm talking days before the COVID-19 stuff really picked up. So the agency still is working on that. Not all rulemaking has stopped, so that's good news, and it's encouraging to see that is still moving along. Maybe a little slower though than hoped for initially.
Dan, you've got your finger on the pulse of the regulatory impact in terms of trucking and all. Do you see any near-term impact, be it existing regulations or moving forward in terms of where we're going based upon what we've seen in trucking in the industry lately?
Yeah, one item related to hours of service that's come up that I've been hearing just by checking social media, Twitter, and listening to some drivers is the question of if an emergency waiver comes into place and essentially removes hours of service for those that are engaged in providing direct support. Should we have hours of service regulations at all? There are a lot of drivers out there that are asking that question. If you're going to do away with them in emergency situations, why do we need them at all? And certainly from our standpoint, we want to see the data behind any changes hours of service rules, and that includes what's proposed in the NPRM currently. How it relates to the COVID-19 emergency declaration, the agency is tracking accidents that take place during this time period. That's part of the emergency declaration. You'd have to report accidents just as you would under normal circumstances. So it'll be curious to see how this impacts trucking as a whole and looking at the data after the fact. The other part that I'll throw out there as well that I've discussed with drivers is not everybody falls under the emergency declaration. It is specific to the operations and what you're engaged in. And even with that, we've talked to a number of carriers that are providing direct support as a result of COVID-19, but are still following the original, the hours of service rules that have been around and are not taking advantage of the emergency declaration. And a lot of that comes down to risk mitigation. Just because you don't have hours of service doesn't mean that all lawsuits go away, fortunately for yourself in dealing with a lot of these. But just because there's no rules doesn't mean that all carriers are automatically throwing all rules out the book. So we actually got a lot of questions early on as far as, what is if I don't need to be driving 11 hours and I can go over that. What is a safe number? And unfortunately, that's a hard question to ask because for each operation, it's different. For each driver, it's going to be different on what he or she may feel comfortable to do. So that's one thing that I reiterated often is that not all carriers have taken advantage. We're actually surveying our membership currently just to see the number of carriers that have taken advantage of the different provisions within the hours of service rules.
How about looking ahead, Dan, long term? Any lasting implications you think of the COVID-19 situation?
Yeah, specifically related to COVID-19, we are starting our focus, and we've been doing this for a number of weeks right now, are looking at what implications are going to be there for drivers when these emergency waivers and declarations go away after COVID-19 is subsided or eventually done and over with. And key factors there dealing with issues such as obtaining renewing your med card. So as you know, the med card expiration period was extended, very similar, just like the CDL expiration date was extended. While that might be a great time frame now, depending on how long this lasts and how long it continues, we're really looking at to make sure that there's enough time for a driver to get into, whether it be the state driver's license agency or a medical facility, to renew their med card. You can't say to a driver, hey, you need to do this in a week or even 14 days or 30 days. So that's something we're taking into account, because there will need to be a time period where drivers are able to go and renew their certifications and get everything taken care of. That way they can be back into compliance. So that's something we're tracking there. With how that goes. Other thing we've been dealing with and looking at a little more closely is current waivers that are in place related to commercial learners permits, and asking the question of our membership, should we work to ask the agency to make any of those permanent? For instance, the one waiver that allows a CDL holder to be elsewhere in the cab, say the sleeper berth, is compared to the passenger seat of a truck that's being driven by a CLP holder. So we're working with our membership to determine, do any of these make sense for the longer term and not just for the short term as a result of COVID-19. So we're getting some great feedback, and if need be, we might work with the agency to petition to make some of those permanent on a long-term basis.
It's interesting, Dan. Do you think what the situation is and the exemptions, the waivers, are generating potentially data that can be used to reform or reshape the regulatory setup of the trucking industry to some degree?
Yeah, it's encouraging to hear remarks from Acting Administrator Jim Mullen from FMCSA. He just made a comment in a trade article I read here recently that they're certainly learning a lot from this pandemic and the regulatory process. So I think that's very much attributable to what I just mentioned with regards to commercial learners permit. Are there waivers that make sense that really don't need to be waivers and need to be something long term? And the data we have from the drivers that are operating currently out there under these emergency declarations, how that apply to perhaps getting behind something and asking for a little more of a long-term ask on a lot of these. And some of these, quite frankly, have been ATA advocacy items that we've been working forward towards on a long term. Hours of service, hate to keep going back there, but this could be data we receive as a result of the pandemic, good or bad, that could help influence future hours of service decision making.
Excellent. Dan, thank you so much again for your time and also great information as always.
Thank you, Doug. We appreciate it.
Thank you. And we're